Lecture, tradition of the Center for American Political Studies. We have a big kickoff lecture every year. And this year we're really pleased to do something completely different, breaking the mold. And the person who convinced us to break the mold is Laura Donaldson, who did a fantastic job organizing this event, the art installation. I'd like to introduce two really amazing people, Bruce Western and Stephen Tourlentes. They come at the same problem from very different ways. Bruce, I've known Bruce, actually, he may not even remember this, but I've known Bruce since he was in graduate school. Many, many years ago, our paths crossed. I'm a professor of government and political science, so like, how did that happen, given you're in sociology? But Bruce has long been one of the leading lights in statistical methods and this more sophisticated study of the quantitative measure of society. But throughout his career, he's been drawn back into real problems of real people's lives. And he's been deeply enmeshed in the struggles that people have dealing with what's now being called the carceral state in the United States. How families are affected, how communities are affected, how individuals' lives are affected by imprisonment. And he has done some of the most powerful, amazing work of academics, and I'm especially proud of the work he does in the prison system here, going into the prisons and teaching prisoners, trying to help people come back into American society. Stephen Tourlentes, I never met Stephen before except through his work, and it's quite powerful work. We have a display of his photographs across the street in our twin brick building, CGIS Knaufel. And after this presentation, there will be a reception at the art installation on the 4th floor of CGIS. We'll start at 5 o'clock. There are hors d'oeuvres and drinks, and it'll be just a nice casual opportunity to meet each other and to really marvel in Stephen's work. It is unbelievably powerful images of death row prisons at night. And those are the images we're seeing reflected and projected behind us. So I'm going to yield the floor to the two of you because I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I really want to hear your two perspectives on this amazing aspect of our society. Bruce, Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm honoured to be part of this conversation with Steve Tourlentes for the 2016 Alexis de Tocqueville Lecture, and many thanks to Stephen Solibaher as well for the opportunity of speaking to you all today. And so what we thought we would do is I would speak for about 15 minutes and provide you with a little bit of statistical background on what's come to be known as mass incarceration, and also talk a little bit about some research I've been doing with Rihanna Cole from the Department of Correction here in Massachusetts and Anthony Braga at Rutgers, interviewing people coming out of prison and returning to neighborhoods in the Boston area. And I thought I'd finish by saying a little bit about the current politics and how we might be thinking politically about the issue of mass incarceration. And we thought Steve and I would then just have a conversation that engaged his rather extraordinary work that's being exhibited here. So let me start by saying a little bit to you about mass incarceration, and so it's kind of a cruel historical irony that when Tocqueville famously visited the United States in 1831, he was here with Gustave de Beaumont. And they'd come to America to see its prisons. And the prisons at that time in the United States were really a marvel of humane social policy and had attracted the attention of the world. And today, of course, we're living in the era of mass incarceration, and our prisons, rather than adding to the quality of our citizenship, which was a theme in Tocqueville's work in the 1830s, rather than adding to the quality of our citizenship, is subtracting from it. So mass incarceration, this was a term that was coined by the sociologist and legal scholar David Garland, and Garland said mass incarceration really consisted of two things. First, it was a level of imprisonment that was comparatively unusual and historically unprecedented. But more than that, he said incarceration becomes so socially concentrated, so unequally distributed, that we're no longer locking up individual offenders, but incarcerating whole groups in society. And for me as a sociologist, this was an utterly intriguing idea. At what point are we no longer locking up the individual, but somehow incarcerating the group? So let me show you some empirical markers, I think, that begin to give us a handle on this idea of incarcerating the group rather than the individual. And for many in this room, these statistics are going to be quite familiar. We measure the size of a penal system in a country with an incarceration rate, and this is typically measured per 100,000 of the population. So throughout Western Europe, incarceration right now is around about 100 per 100,000. That's about 0.1 of 1% of the total population is behind bars in Western Europe on any given day. And in the United States, it's nearly an order of magnitude larger. We now have an incarceration rate around 700 per 100,000 in prison and jail that's incarcerated on a typical day. And we can also think about the scale of the penal system. We can also think about it historically. And if we go back to the 1920s, from 1920s to the early 1970s, the rate of imprisonment in the United States was around 100 per 100,000, what it is in Western Europe today. And in the early 1970s, the system began to grow, and it grew every year for about the next 35 or 40 years. And so we're now standing or sitting at the top of this apex in the trajectory in the American penal system. In numbers, this means that there's about 1.6 million people in state or federal prison. There's about another 730,000 people who are either awaiting trial or serving short sentences. Now, that's not the entire population under correctional control, because we have another 850,000 people who are under the supervision of a parole officer, and they're out in the community. And then there's a group who are on probation, who are given suspended sentences, and there's now about 3.9 million people on probation. You add it all up, and there's about 7 million people now under some sort of correctional supervision in the United States. And this is historically new. Now, as striking as these figures are, that's not what's most important about incarceration in the United States right now. What's most important about US incarceration is its unequal distribution across the population. And one way we tried to think about this was by asking, well, what's the likelihood that someone's ever going to serve time in prison at some point in their lives? And we looked at a birth cohort that was born just after World War II. And if we think about African American men, non-college African American men who either have high school diplomas or dropped out of high school, if they were born in the late 1940s, they're reaching their mid-30s, which is the period over which you're likely ever to go to prison. They're reaching their mid-30s by the end of the 1970s, and that's before the American prison boom really takes off. So for non-college African American men, about 1 in 8, we estimate, are going to serve time in prison at some point in their lives. Now we're just talking about state or federal prison, and this is the deep end of the system, serving time for a felony, 12 months at a minimum, about 28 months of time served at the median. About 1 in 8 of non-college African American men. And we compared these men to another birth cohort that was born in the late 1970s. And so those men are reaching their mid-30s around 2009, 2010, and they're growing up through the American prison boom. And so for non-college African American men, we estimate that over a third will go to prison at some point in their lives. And this is about the lower 50% of the education distribution of African American men. And if they dropped out of high school, chances that they'd serve time in prison is around about 2/3. So for very low educated African American men in recent birth cohorts, serving time in prison has become absolutely normal. And that's new. We only need go back 2 or 3 decades to find a time when the penal system was not a ubiquitous presence in the lives of African American men with low levels of schooling. So I spent a lot of time talking to people about statistics like these, and there were congressional hearings and sentencing commissions and mayors and city councillors, and I thought the statistics would speak for themselves. But anyone who can say, I thought the statistics would speak for themselves, really shouldn't be allowed anywhere near the political process. And so it was Real World 1, Ivory Tower 0. And so I started to try and figure this out. Why was evidence of a failed policy not enough to change that policy? Well, for one, I'd been teaching in prisons and talking to people in community programs and talking to people in parole and corrections. And the statistics I was talking about were somehow missing that reality. There are all these human stories that were missing. And the human stories, I think, are quite important because the politics of crime is often about demonizing and vilifying and conjuring up monsters. And the politics of crime makes people less than human. But human stories show us what we share with each other. Human stories allow us to see something of ourselves in others. So over the last 3 years, a research team at Harvard began a series of interviews with 135 men and women who were leaving prison and returning to neighborhoods in the Boston area. And with Rihanna here, I should absolutely acknowledge the extraordinary role of the Massachusetts Department of Correction in this project, who helped us in countless ways. And I think as a consequence of that assistance, we were able to do something really quite unique in the interviews we're conducting. Now, nearly all of the former prisoners we spoke to grew up in poor homes, but more than just poverty, we heard a lot about violence and untreated addiction and mental illness and childhood trauma. And we also heard a lot about really heroic efforts to find work and to get clean. And we talked to mothers and sisters who were taking care of their grown sons and brothers. And all of these things, I think, were the missing pieces. So I want to read you quickly an excerpt from a paper I've been working on this year on violence. Patrick was born in 1981, and he lived the first year of his life in the Old Colony housing projects, one of a cluster of public housing complexes in South Boston. Southie of the early 1980s remained one of the few neighborhoods of concentrated white poverty in urban America and a stronghold of Boston's Irish American working class. Patrick's mother was a heroin addict and gave up custody of her son to her parents when she was 5. She died of AIDS when Patrick was 17. Patrick's father left his mother when his son was 2, but 20 years later he would re-enter his son's life, helping him to find a union job in the construction industry. Patrick's grandparents were reluctant guardians. His grandmother had raised a family of 8 children in the small wood house on J Street, a few blocks from Old Colony. His grandfather had a 7th grade education and for many years struggled to find steady work because of his own criminal history. 13 people lived in the house when Patrick was growing up, and much of the energy at home was provided by his uncles, a brawling pair of young men who used drugs and alcohol heavily. My uncles and my mother were all heroin addicts, he said, and the house was the venue for violence, sexual abuse, addiction, and a sprawling kind of family life that Patrick described as emotionally cold and insane. And yet, he added, it was normal to me. Reflecting on the childhood home, Patrick's aunt recalled, it was just a crazy house between my brothers coming in, either beat up or having some horrible car accident, or someone falling asleep with a cigarette and a mattress going up on fire. It was a very traumatic house to live in. Patrick's mother wasn't allowed in the house on J Street. Still, she stayed in contact with her son, and we know this through his descriptions of his beatings at the hands of his mother's boyfriends. And this was from age 5 through his teenage years. So in violent and chaotic homes, the world isn't neatly divided into victims and offenders as the criminal justice system would often have it. Instead, in different times and places, people are victims and offenders and witnesses and participants, and each of these roles is inhabited in due course. And prison can be violent too, of course. And one of my first interviews was at a minimum security prison with Peter, an African-American man in his late 40s, and he'd spent most of his life in prison. I just wanted to show you very quickly a video clip of Peter.
As a kid, I thought my father was the toughest person. I thought the only person that put fear in me was my father. When I went to prison, I found out my father wasn't shit. He was scared of me. I stabbed 4 people in one day. I didn't care. I didn't care. I didn't care.
How old were you?
19, 20.
Yeah. And what happened after that?
I went to the hole.
Yeah.
I went to the hole, and that's when they sent me up the wall pole. You know? But
yeah.
And from there, it was just uphill. Nothing but violence.
Yeah.
Violence. But I was never like that. I thought that I can go to jail and just stay to myself, do my time, and get out. Nope.
So, in the reentry study sample, there was a lot of violence, and there was a lot of poverty as well. And this was the context in which violence flourished. And we spoke to a lot of people who grew up in poor homes, and often mothers were working, and there weren't many adults around to keep an eye on the kids. And often the adults had serious problems of their own, untreated addiction and mental illness. And this also contributed to chaos at home. A lot of people we spoke to grew up in poor neighbourhoods, and these neighbourhoods were disorderly, and violence was on the street, and young men in particular took steps to protect themselves, which sometimes escalated things even further. I want to show you one last short video of Peter, and he's telling the story of driving from Boston to New York with his son to get him a suit for the funeral of his son's brother. And this was a boy who was shot dead while waiting for a bus on his way home from school.
I was taking my son to New York, my youngest son to New York, to get him a suit to go to his brother's funeral, and my mother called me because she had found out what happened. And I cried all the way to New York. My son was in the back seat sleeping, but I can see that he was he was going through it mentally. He was going through it mentally, and I cried, and I asked my mother, I told my mother, I said, Mom, if I change my life, will he take care of us? And she was like, who? And I was like, God, if I change my life, is he to take care of us? And she was like, yeah. She said, yeah, just trust and believe, he'll take care of you. So I made a decision to change my life. He's taking care of us.
Yeah.
He's taking care of us.
Yeah.
So, in the context of what are often very complicated and troubled lives, the criminal justice system often asks of people heroic acts of self-transformation. And much more rarely, I think, do our political leaders ask for such change in the institutions that they themselves have created. But this is a very rare moment right now, I think. We've been hearing a lot about criminal justice reform over the last year and the last few months. Hillary Clinton gave a big speech about mass incarceration. President Obama said he wants to make criminal justice reform a key priority of the final year of his administration. I want to close there and begin a conversation with Steve. But I think for those of us who are working on this problem, and I know there are many students in this room who are, I think one of the main challenges for us in our research is precisely to engage a level of compassion and curiosity, so our work can be humanizing, so we can see something of ourselves in others. And in this way, I think, we can make our own contribution to peace and justice. But let me bring Steve into the conversation at this point. And as we were talking, Steve, you've got a personal connection, I know, to the issue of prisons and incarceration.
Yeah, thank you. This is very informative, and I appreciate being able to be here and discuss this with you. My introduction to it comes from sort of a background with my father, who was involved in the mental health system and very deeply involved in community mental health. And he was a psychiatrist in Illinois, where I grew up. And at one point in time, I lived on the grounds of a state mental hospital, and 1,800 patients and 900 employees. And over a period of time, as I was growing up, deinstitutionalization came into effect, and those hospitals were emptied out, and the clientele was spread out into the masses for some good reasons, and some that didn't work quite so well. So I was home visiting my father and my mother in Illinois once around Christmas, and I looked off into the distance, and if any of you have been to Illinois, it's a prairie, very big skies, and I saw something on the edge of the city, the town, not a big city, that was not there before, and it was this beautiful light. And I asked him, what is that? And he said, that's the new prison. And so I questioned about that, and he said, some of my patients are in that prison now. And it sort of stuck with me and stuck in my craw a bit, and I made a photograph of that. Quite interesting light, and it was in on the prairie, how that sort of stood out. And I just sat with that for a while. I didn't think that much of it. I just was something that sort of sat in the back of my mind. It didn't jump right away that I'm going to be invested in this. But that picture kind of kept climbing out of my file cabinet and wouldn't leave me alone. And it felt like I needed to look into this more and to somewhat bear witness to what I saw was happening with the prison system, and how in these small communities that used to have manufacturing and farming and in this case a therapeutic hospital, they were being replaced as those that part of the economy fell apart with these large cities on the edge of town, these cities of light that were actually prisons.
It's we were talking the other day about how each of us in our own way have found this a very compelling institution for some reason, and I think neither of us expected after our first contact with prisons that our life's work would very much be dominated by this institution. Why do you think that's happened in your case? Why does the institution have so much power over you?
I think for me that photography is a language in a way. I think I'm much better in terms of my pictures than in, let's say, in a situation like this in terms of talking about it. But I think that I was trying to understand what our humanity is, who we are, and I don't know if it's connected to maybe my father's interest in psychiatry or in that background, but I was very compelled to kind of understand who builds these and why they're necessary, and then suddenly why were a lot of them necessary. I really do feel like these institutions are mirrors. They're mirrors of who we are. A certain part of a mirror, not of the entirety, but they are part of us, and why they're built is a great riddle. So I think my pictures are really good at asking questions. I'm not so sure in terms of how, the answer is for all of us to kind of determine.
Yeah. Another thing that strikes me about the photographs, which I think are extraordinary, is how American they are. I mean, these are at one level, the photos are landscapes. They're American landscapes, and could you say something about that? Is that part of the intention of the work, to say not something just about the institution, but to say something about the nation as well?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that my roots are kind of as a landscape photographer, and so this is, in one sense, a landscape photography project that happens to have prisons in all of the pictures, because I think a lot of these institutions, and especially the way that I photograph them, are not architecturally that different. They sort of are built to function in a certain way that hasn't changed dramatically in hundreds of years. They're meant to contain and have a human cargo. But what changes, and the importance to my work, is that you see how many of them there are, where they are, and that each one of you probably knows one of these landscapes, one of these places. So it somehow, I guess maybe if I'm being a little subversive, I'm sort of implicating you also in kind of witnessing the place that maybe you don't necessarily want to go to. I want your imagination to kind of be involved in what that place is with your pictures. And the boundary of the picture doesn't end with the frame. It's sort of meant for your imagination to extend beyond that and back to wherever you are.
Yeah, there's some deep paradox there, I feel, because at some level, and I mean, I think about trying to think through this in my own work as well, that these, on the one hand, prisons are sort of invisible institutions, and in part that's because incarceration, as we know, is so socially concentrated in a very small fraction of the population that the mainstream of American society rarely thinks about at all. So at some level, prisons are invisible, and they're deeply compelling, they're deeply powerful places, because I think they're telling us something significant about American values as they're lived and institutionalized. And I feel I'm sort of struggling with that all of the time, that these are profoundly significant institutions, and yet their reality is difficult to convey. You know, it's difficult absolutely. To provoke a national conversation about it.
Yeah. No, I mean, when I first started into it, and I think partially when I was describing that picture that kind of stuck with me, I also saw a photograph. I don't know the photographer's name, but it was a series that was in the New York Times Magazine back in the 90s, and it basically showed photographs of a library in a New York public school, and that library was, to be kind, was in very, very bad condition. Broken furniture, books that were damaged by water, disheveled. And then it showed a picture that was taken in a prison library that was in much better condition, in much better shape. And it felt to me in a way it was something that kind of talked about the pipeline of how these prisons are filled up and where our resources are being put, and the instincts of how we deal with crime. And it felt like certain communities were sort of the cudgel of the prison was being used against certain communities. And it was sort of reinforcing these places, and these places became these sort of abstract time machines in a certain respect. That when when certain people go in because it's in the news, but you don't hear very often once people are coming out. And so they're these strange middle worlds. And what transforms them when somebody comes out of that prison versus how they went in is very complex and disturbing in terms of how we support each other.
Yeah, yeah. And there's something here too, in your work about rural America's confrontation with something alien, or...
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. No, it's. I mean, there's been a lot of things written about this, but the idea that people in farm country, which are suddenly guarding urban prisoners who are sort of sent into exile, and these, it's very abstract. It's this very kind of bizarre situation in a lot of cases, and. I remember I was down in Texas and I had to get permission to photograph. Usually I skirt the law a little bit at times to make my pictures.
I'm going to ask you about that.
but in Texas there is a very intense correctional system. So it's called the Public Safety, Department of Public Safety in Texas. But so I had to get permission to photograph a certain prison, and they sent a guard with me to determine where I could be on the periphery to make this picture. And he was maybe right out of high school, and he'd been working there for about 6 months, and it was very profound to me in terms of having somebody that new to the world or that fresh in the world, also sort of in a supervisory place over people who have no access to the world, and it's the abstract nature of it is something that sort of draws me in.
Yeah.
And the idea that you can be in a community and, like, on one side of the wall, time is different than on the other side of the wall. And that's where I think that the light in my pictures flows. The light can't really be contained. It's something almost like water that seeps in and out. So it's this permeable thing where we've actually put these physical boundaries for our bodies.
Yeah, yeah. It's I know from our interviews too, it's kind of particularly for people who have done a lot of prison time, reflecting on short periods in prison, maybe 30 or 60 days in jail, or a 2-year sentence or something like that. That time for them seems small when they report back to us on that period of incarceration, which seems extraordinary to me, that a life history of institutionalization winds up producing that kind of perspective on time.
Sure.
So before we open the discussion to the floor, could you say something a bit about your working process and
Oh, sure.
and what that looks like?
Yeah, I'm very old-fashioned. I use an 8x10 view camera, so hood over my head and a film holder that goes in, and it's a beautiful camera, and it records light beautifully. But these are very long exposures, in some cases up to 30 minutes long, and my camera's gotten me out of trouble a few times. Just because of how ridiculous it looks, when I am confronted by the state police or the prison officials when I'm someplace where I'm not supposed to be, and because I'm on a tripod and I'm sort of out there, kind of like it's almost like a clown suit, and
it's nighttime.
And it's nighttime. It's nighttime, and they're like, what, and I'm not climbing through the brush with a big long camera, like, and taking these secret pictures. I'm sort of out there, and I let them look through the camera, and often they're kind of interested in it. They're kind of like, wow, that's an old camera. That's really interesting. But the funniest experience I had was down in Trenton, New Jersey, where the state prison is very famous, and it's right in the middle of the city. And I was trying to photograph it, and there was a bar right by the entrance that goes in. So I was on a public street, and I was out making a picture, and then slowly the doors open up, and this van comes out with 4 guys in it, and they're like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm taking a picture of the prison." And they're like, "You can't do that." I'm like, "Well, I'm on a public street. You can't do that." And this was like a Friday night, Labor Day weekend. I'm like, okay, I'm going to fight with these 4 guys about this. So fortunately, because the way my process works, I had already started the exposure. So I stalled them. And I sat and I kind of talked. I didn't get combative, but I just said, okay, I got this one chance. And we talked, and then after about 3 or 4 minutes, I went, okay, you guys win, I'll leave. And I left. But it was kind of stunning to me that, on this, like, somebody could walk out the door of their house or stand in their bedroom window and make this picture if they wanted to, but because I kind of came out and did it formally,
Yeah.
they didn't like that.
I know that prison well. I taught in that prison when I was at Princeton, and taught a number of sociology classes in that prison. It's an old school.
It's an old school prison
institution. Yeah.
And it's interesting now also with the advent of like the marketplace entering into the system, and with private prisons, that there's, in some of these places, it's been incentivized to keep those prisons full. Those companies that run those prisons have contracts, and they that's how they earn their pay. But I had a strange experience. I was in Mississippi trying to go to the Parchman Farm, which is a very famous plantation-style prison, and I got lost, and I was in Tutwiler, and I thought I saw the prison because I saw lights and I knew what it was. And I stopped, the guy asked him, and I said, "Is that the Parchman Farm?" And he said, "Oh, no. That's the Hawaiian Prison." "The Hawaiian Prison? What do you mean?" He said, that prison's full of Hawaiians. And he goes, oh yeah, that's like some company runs that prison. Everybody's brought in from Hawaii. They have their own special diets and everything, and you know, the parchment farm is down that way. That's the state prison. This is private enterprise over there.
Wow. So with that, we should open the floor. And if you could just identify yourself as well.
Yeah, my name is Lilian. Oh, okay, sorry. My name is Lilian Bovea. I'm a sociologist at Bentley University. And I think that, thank you for the presentation, those presentations. I think that there is no doubt that here in the United States, the penal system, the incarceration system is so ingrained that you can tell not only for the data that you show, but the whole qualitative change that we have seen that shows how the system had become more stronger every time. Now we know that there is more the expansion of the solitary confinement, for example, which is the prison within the prison. It's one of the most, I will say, indicators of how strong the system is becoming. The fact that there is not only African American and Latinos, but also white citizens that are incarcerated, and the process of the kind of becoming a revolving door of, you know, putting together mentally ill people and homeless. It's really becoming a de facto solution. But my question is still, what can explain that, you know, that rationale, that what explains the ubiquitous of this system in the society? As you show correctly, United States still is in the top of even developing countries, not even developed, but developing countries in terms of incarceration. And I wonder if the framework of using Max Weber idea about institution and about legitimacy, the idea that Weber explained how you know, legitimacy relied on, you know, a series of economic values, motivation. What you were saying precisely about the fact that what we are as a human being, in one hand, there is an economic motivation, the whole privatization process that you explain, the fact also that for many of these small towns, that means employment, that means a series of things that become, even though it's very impressive to have that, I mean, visually to have that, but even your picture, what your picture, when I see your picture, what it's told me is that they are the bad guys, and we are lucky to be outside, and for some reason we are outside. So there is also, as Weber was saying, kind of value or kind of, you know, inner immaterial motivation behind that. So my point is, what kind of reflection, analysis, framework, theoretical framework can help us to explain the different rationalities or rationales behind the reproduction and the perpetuation of this system, which is growing. It's not minimizing it. It's on the contrary, expanding qualitative and quantitative in qualitative and quantitative terms, basically.
Well, I think that there is some, you know, we're at a point right now, which is an interesting point in time, where there are more voices pushing back. But I think the growth of this system is related to, you know, you can go back to Jim Crow, you know, that there's certain communities and certain groups of people that it has affected and kept in a certain position. Like, I really do feel like, you know, in the case of mental health, I think for some people, the first mental health worker that they meet might be a police officer. They're not really a mental health worker, but that's the first person that they often confront, or a judge. And they're getting, you know, and the prisons themselves are being asked to provide the mental health care that a large percent of that population are under. So it's our value system. This requires a major investment and rearrangement of the barometer of how we see ourselves. And it really means investing not only just in changing the prisons, but before the prison even becomes a conversation. You know, if a kid can't read by 2nd or 3rd grade, their chances of entering the prison system is dramatically higher. You know, so it goes into schools, it goes into a lot of things where we just have tended to pull money out of to pay for other things or not willing to invest in them. It's an investment issue, I really think.
I agree with a lot of that. I should say, as an empirical matter, incarceration rates really peaked around 2008, 2009, and they've just started to tick down a little bit. And I do think we're having a very different kind of political conversation right now than we were even 3 or 4 years ago. And the system grew through a whole series of policy choices, and that tells me that the system can also be wound back through policy choices, through the political process. And I think Steve's exactly right that while the system was growing, the prison became a social policy instrument of last resort, and so we see tremendously disproportionate overrepresentation of people with histories of school failure, mental illness, and untreated addiction, which also makes me optimistic about policy change, because these are social problems for which there are solutions that look very different from incarceration. That incarceration is overwhelmingly concentrated in poor communities and poor communities of colour, I think describes very much the political challenge as we try and build these social policy alternatives. But I think already there's a tremendous organising effort and political activism on the part of those communities themselves, which is pushing the conversation in a different direction. One more, I'm told. Yes.
Hi, my name is Spencer Glendon. I'm a friend of Steve's, and I don't know how many years ago, 20-some years ago, I received funding for my PhD from the Harvard Political Science Department, so I'm grateful to this center. But I want to ask you about your Ivory Tower Zero, Real World One skirmish, and about these photos. So the canonical form of academic work remains the black and white 8.5 by 11 text-based argument, and there's now a pretty large body of evidence that that's really a bad way to convince people of anything. That using a histogram as an argument is a pretty good way to get people to glaze over, but these are no less factual, these photographs. And so I was interested that in this setting you used video and you used photo, and I wonder about your thoughts about not only scholarship narrowly defined, but also the translation of scholarship into a broader discussion about, not just in the Belfer Center, but in general, how to use other media to make arguments in a way that's not any less true, but in fact maybe more true and also more resonant.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for me this is almost the preeminent question for me now. How do we talk about this social reality in a way that can convey its moral urgency, and research has a role to play, but it's a limited role, clearly. I mean, the thing I'm thinking about most now, and this is the topic of a much longer discussion, I think, and what I was trying to convey in my remarks, is the importance of making this a human problem. And so what does that mean? What is making mass incarceration a human problem mean? I think partly it means trying to render people in a way that reaches us, that we can see something of ourselves in people who are coming into contact with the criminal justice system. And I think the two ways specifically to do that, this is what I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, is to show people in their creativity. I think that's a very human quality to which we can all relate, and to show people in their loving relationships. And that's also, I think, a deeply human quality to which we can all relate. And I think we should definitely not be confined to the 8.5 by 11 text-based argument, and there is a role for video. And I've gotten to a point where I think I would feel absolutely remiss if the people I had been speaking to, if their voices weren't represented in a very direct way in any presentation I'm doing, and so that's sort of the issue as I'm struggling with it at the moment. Last thing I'd say is I don't think anyone's really got an answer to this at the moment, how to talk about the problem of mass incarceration in the most compelling way. And what I see is like a million different experiments, and I hope this panel can contribute to that process of experimentation.
Please join me in thanking Bruce and Steve.